But it's good to see you guys all back for part 3 of my ARC Apologetics series. Thank you for still coming, I gotta say. Because I know last year at Parkview's lectureship, they said a good preacher should hit about 30 verses or so per sermon. I counted it up at the end, and it doesn't even touch 20 tonight because we're focusing so much on this one. So I hope you guys forgive me for that. But so as you know, this is probably more of a Sunday evening topic. It goes in a lot more deeply into this just one specific Bible story. As mentioned, it has been a little while since we've met on this, since I was gone last year when Joe was on vacation. So in part 1, we covered literary evidences and evidences of other cultures around the globes that at one point there was a global flood, that this wasn't an allegory. It wasn't just something that happened in Palestine and it got blown out of proportion in the story, that it was truly a global event. Then in part 2, a couple of months later, we covered fossil evidences for a literal flood. And if you've forgotten either of those or you need anything from them, let me know. I can get you either video or notes or whatever from that. But tonight, and then for the other couple sections that come after, it's going to be focusing more on questions that deal with one aspect of the story that have been raised over the years by skeptics. Tonight it's going to be on the ark itself, and then next time Joe's on vacation, it'll be dealing with the animals in the ark, and then after that, the last one will be on the waters themselves. For these lessons, I'm going to be following a standardized format. I'll state the question first, along with the verse where it's being brought from, the Genesis account, then list why some have so many questions with that topic, before finally providing our evidence and logic behind continuing to believe in the Bible's account. Tonight we'll be looking at 6 questions. And the first of which is the largest question that they have, pun intended there, because the ark was a very large boat. In Genesis 6:15, the account records that God told Noah to build the ark to be 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 cubits high. A cubit, mind you, back then is roughly from the elbow out to the tip of a finger, and generally we translate that as about to be 18 inches, which would make the ark more or less about 450 feet long by 75 feet by 45 feet high. The problem that a lot of skeptics have is that the only real viable material available to construct boats back then was wood. They say that there aren't any other real records of boats anywhere near that time in history that were that size. They also like to point to a couple of years just before COVID. Did I open that up? I'm sorry. Do you know how to close the... There we go. Thank you. So in addition to the ark that we have in Kentucky, they also made one in Europe to full scale, and they put it on a barge bottom. And when they then tried to sail it across from Norway over to the UK, it almost sunk. So they love to point that, oh, there's no way it really could have been out in a storm for a full year. We couldn't, all that kind of stuff. And then there also was the USS Wyoming. That would be the one that's underneath the large ship failures on the screen behind me. That one, for people who don't trust ancient accounts, that one was built here in 1909 in the United States. It was the largest wood-hulled ship ever made. It was 450 feet long with a 50-foot beam. And it reached this extreme length. It used a lot of iron banding to reinforce the hull because it tended to bend and twist in any kind of rough weather. And it had a lot of pumps to continue trying to empty out the hold so it didn't sink. And even with all of that more modern technology in 1924, it did sink in a nor'easter. So they say, well, then how on earth could you have had a wood boat that size hold up? To counter their point, I ask a question back, why would anyone else have tried to build another ark after the flood? God sent the rainbow. He promised there was never going to be another flood. What would the point have been? There wasn't anything in the ark's plan of masts for sails. There was no rudder to navigate. You couldn't use it to bring fish in. off the coast. There wasn't even necessarily an anchor on it. Its only purpose was to pick up, hold, and then set back down and stay floating. And it took them, what was it, around 100 years to build, and now they didn't have all the rest of whatever civilization was around them to support them during that time. They had to support themselves after that. Why would they have tried to build another ark? But also, to answer the question of could a boat that size float, there we go. I had these out of order. Much more recently anyway, I'm not going to say recent because it was during World War II, built the Liberty class of boats. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is the one on the screen behind me. It's one of our last two that we kept around as a sample just to continue to show people, but it was 442 feet long with a beam of 57 feet and a draft of over 30 feet, and it made 4 round-trip crossings of the Atlantic, and then later on was assigned to the Pacific later in the war as it continued with Japan. So we definitely proved that a boat that size can float. Those are good dimensions for it. Just really leaving the question of could someone have built one out of wood? Whether or not they were able to then, we know that what we know, that we couldn't build one per se. However, we have a couple of examples here, one of which was by Athenaeus, I believe I'm sorry, I'm terrible pronouncing those Greek names, but he was a Greek historian. He recorded a warship built by Ptolemy Philopator somewhere just a little before 200 BC. It was described as being 420 feet long by 57 feet wide to about 72 feet high at the top of her gunwales. Some of the citation for that is on the screen behind me, or it'll be available in the video and slides if you want to look more into that later. That was the closest one I could find to the ark size in wood. Moving on to our second question tonight then, in terms of construction facilities, generally when we build boats today, a lot of times we have to have something like this. It's called the shipyard or the dry dock to build it. And a lot of skeptics are like, well, how on earth could he have built one big enough to hold the ark? No one had built an ark before, and you'd need it to hold it and to launch the ship. Let's see. They would have taken extra time to build this in addition to building the ark itself. And there wouldn't have been anybody, like I said, that would have built one before. But again, answering back to the purpose of the ship dock or dry dock is the one you see there is in our Boston harbor we have today. It was able to you build the ship or you repair the ship there to work on it below the water line and to put the keel together. And then you would open those doors at the far end in order to release it out into the Atlantic. However, I think some of this would be kind of redundant in the case of the ark, as in Genesis 7:11, the fountains of the deep burst forth, as well as the rain falling from heaven. And instead, also in 7:17 there at the bottom. And so, while they might have had something to help them line up the keel and to start the hull assembly at the bottom, you wouldn't have needed a full-on ship dock, and for that matter, whatever support that they would have built for it probably would have been washed away in the flood. So why are you surprised that you're not finding any evidence of it? That doesn't make any sense to me. But so that was our first two questions. Our third one tonight, getting a little bit more into the particulars, is in the deck heights of the ark. There in Genesis 6 and verses 15 and 16 he read for us this evening, it was to be 30 cubits high, to be made up of a lower, a second, and a third deck. So as we mentioned, that's about 45 feet, and people like to round and say that, oh, that's about 15 feet apiece. Well, that seems kind of impractical. It's too big. The picture on the Michelle is in up there, that is taken in the USS Constitution last year on our trip to Boston, and you can see she's having to duck pretty substantially. They made the decks pretty small on the wood ships. There wasn't any wasting volume or weight. So that's why a lot of skeptics also like to say, well, why on earth are you building one that tall? And, well, a big part of that was it wasn't an armed ship. It was a cargo ship. A lot of the purpose of the tiny decks and ships is to be able to stack more cannons in and be able to sleep everybody. And be able while still being able to go fast. That's not really the purpose of the ark. The purpose of the ark was carrying cargo where you want a couple of large open spaces. And then conversely, on the other side, you have people who say that the decks inside would have had to have been too short, as you can see in the cartoon pictures behind me. For that, the Denver Zoo's website, just the first one I looked at, was the average height of the adult male giraffe is between 16 to 18 feet. A deck height of 15 feet would be too short. He'd be having to duck the whole time, or be sitting, or stick his head out the window on the top level, like they generally make them do in the cartoons we put in the beginner's Bibles. Or also, as there were dinosaurs at the time, in a literal interpretation of Genesis, man and dinosaurs would have been together at the same time. So you also would have had to deal with taking a T-Rex, for example, on that. I know all you guys know what a T-Rex looks like. I'm imagining most of you have seen at least one of the Jurassic Park movies, right? Like, there are a lot of them at this point. But so those things usually get to be about 20 feet tall. So that's definitely not going to fit into a 15-foot deck. Two good potential answers we have back to this. It could be either of them, or maybe neither. But in number one, nobody said all of the animals taken were adult animals at their full growth size. A baby giraffe is born, it's only about 6 feet tall, so I guess my height. That's still seems really big for a baby, but also, if you're going to say that, well, maybe the 8 people on the ark don't want to take care of babies of every species out there during the year that they were in the ark. So let's say it was maybe an adolescent giraffe, then it's only about 12 feet tall, so that would still fit. And similar growth spurts in dinosaurs as well. Or also, we just took an estimate with the 15 feet there. It just says 3 decks. It could have been 15, 15, 15. It could have been 29, 8, and 8. So then you have a deck with the most headroom, or maybe something like 20, 12, and 13. There's nothing that says what it is. We just like round numbers when we make guesses. There's nothing says that it had to be. There wasn't that detail given. Moving on then into our fourth question tonight. This is going to be on the window or ventilation of the ark. This one, a lot of the different translations we have in English don't really agree. In KJV, or the NKJV as you read tonight, thank you for us, said that you shall make a window. The ESV sometimes says skylight or has notes calling it a roof. The American Standard Version calls it a light for the ark that shall be finished. The big question they have is, how can the one opening, no matter what it's called, be big enough to let enough air in to circulate to provide for the 8 humans and all of the animals on the ark across all 3 decks? Well, these instructions only include the one dimension, the 1 cubit from the top. Others have kind of tried to interpret it out from that. Skeptics claim that this window is the same one that Noah would have released the birds from in Genesis 8 and 6. Or some of our apologetists, sorry, that's a mouthful, have claimed that it's a vent or an opening or a series of windows like the picture I had on the other slide, all of which, were about 18 inches tall. And others also say that, it just says to a cubit from above, so maybe that's not a cubit of the window itself. That could just be saying that the window is a cubit from the top, that the spacing between the top of the window and the roof of the ark would have then been that 18 inches. I don't really know which one of those necessarily is going to be true, but they're both fairly valid interpretations, in my opinion, from the study. Because as we mentioned, only one dimension is given, a window, 2-dimensional object. You don't know what the other one could be. And also, the word that we have here in Genesis 6:16, to sohar, as you can see on the screen behind me, it's only used here. The one over in Genesis 8 and 6 is shaloan. I'm, again, guessing on the pronunciation. I didn't major in Hebrew, but I do know it was also used there in Genesis 26:8, and was also used to describe Rahab's window in Joshua chapter 2. So this word could have been something for like a array of windows or something to that nature, but without some more uses, we really don't know necessarily what it is to say, but just that there was an opening there. Our fifth question tonight deals with another one of those one place in the Bible words, the gopher wood. There in Genesis 6:14, he was to make himself an ark of gopher wood. Those who like to pick the Bible apart and to make it kind of sound more of a fable and less believable, like to point out we don't know what kind of wood that is, and the issues arise because this word kupar there is a hapax legomenon, which is again a fancy way of saying this only occurs here. But there are three interesting schools of thought into what that's going to be. I'll warn you up front, though, again, we don't really know which one it is, but some of them make some good sense, just for your knowledge in case anyone ever asks you what gopher wood is. The first school of thought that people like to go with, not my personal favorite, but just going through it first, was that this is a transliterated word when Moses wrote the Torah to begin with. Not just us transliterating kupar to gopher, but that Noah wrote an account of his flood somewhere in whatever language they used before the city of Babel. And then when Moses was recording the history from those, he came to this word and didn't know what it was. And so he wrote down just what it had said before. But this one seems a lot less likely to me because Moses did talk to God so much in getting the law. Why wouldn't he have just been able to ask if he didn't know what the word was, if it was something he needed? But this one is a favorite by those who seek to weaken the claim of the Bible to being inspired by God. A second school of thought is that kupar is maybe the species of tree, such as over in Exodus 25:10, where Moses is told to build with the trees of Acacia, or in 1 Kings 6:23 to 31, where it is specified to be building with tree of olives. This would then mean that kupar is maybe some other type of tree, just not used for any of the other construction projects listed in the Old Testament. One commonly put forward is the cypress, especially as Adam Clark mentioned in his commentary, the root word for cypress there on the screen behind me. I'm not going to try to say that one, but that the root is pretty similar to kupar. Personally, I don't think it really could be cypress necessarily as we understand cypress today, because that one was used in 1 Kings 5:8 to 10, but maybe something in a similar family. But then also as a third school of thought, seen in some of the earlier translations of the Bible, and such as in the Septuagint, when the Bible was translated into Hebrew into Greek, so that would have then been the copy that they would most often use around Jesus's day there. But there it's translated as squared beams, or later on when they translated it into the Latin Vulgate, there gopher's translated as planed, as in flat-sided, level, or like boards. So perhaps this was God's way of saying then that Noah could have bought planks or beams to build his ark with, that he and his sons didn't have to go out and cut down and dry every tree themselves, which would be quite the task. But this then is also conveniently leads into our last question that we're going to be looking at tonight, namely for the man hours of the construction. They say, all right, well, you have 4 guys. All right, say we give them, however long it's going to take. When you're looking at other projects today, it still, to some people, doesn't add up. For example, like I mentioned, the USS Constitution before. That one took 13 years for the United States to build. And that was using resources and manpower from at least 10 of the original 13 colonies, and involved so much getting work done through the shipyards that they sadly resorted to slave labor in order to get all of the trees cut in time and dried and processed and up there. And it took, out of curiosity's sake, I looked it up, it was about 60 acres of trees just for that. So then you think, to scale that out, that would have been a whole lot more trees for the ark. So you can see why some maybe might have a little bit of trouble with it. Why Hollywood decided that they needed to have giant stone angels helping them in that movie a few years ago, but I don't think so. And again, I'm using roughly 100 years of this time frame because in Genesis 5:32, Noah is listed as being 500 and having his 3 sons, and then in 7:6 that he was 600 when the waters came upon the earth. And again, that's kind of being a little generous in it, because if Japheth was born right at the beginning of that, he probably wouldn't have been a whole lot of help when he was a baby. But in any case, if we say that, then it's often suggested then that they would have needed to be able to take some kind of aids, such as in not building the full shipyard, as we mentioned earlier, just having some kind of lighter supports, or being able to buy wood instead of having to cut it for themselves, or also that he probably would have needed to, if he could have, hired whatever help there was. Just because only 8 of them got on the ark, there's nothing that necessarily says only the 8 of them ever touched it. I don't know. But I don't really find any reason to believe that it wouldn't have been possible for them to build the ark in this window, as long as he had the resources he needed to start with. And nowhere else in the Bible does God tell someone to do something they couldn't. Naaman, as long as he was willing to, could still reach the right river to be dipped in, to be cleansed of his leprosy. Moses, when he was called to help organize the building of the tabernacle, even with all of the detail and the money and the expense it took, there were still enough donations to be had. And when Gideon had to go out and confront the Midianites, there were still enough volunteers to help him. Well, actually so many that God sent a lot of them home. But nowhere else is there ever set out a task that couldn't be done. So in conclusion tonight, we've taken a look at, probably seems to a lot of you, really nitpicky dissection of a pretty basic Bible story. But the main thing to take away tonight, in addition to being able to answer some of these questions a little bit better, is that God always supplies the level of detail you need for whatever tasks he puts out, while still trying to leave some room for us to figure things out. In applying that to salvation, God's plan is to hear the word there in Romans 10:17 and to believe, and then to take that and to be baptized there in Acts 2:38. God didn't specify that the word needed to only be preached by Joe or somebody else with fancy degrees, or that it even needed to be done in person. Also, now that we have online stuff, and also in baptism, God didn't say that you had to be baptized at the Sea of Galilee or in the Dead Sea, or even in a nice heated baptistry like the one we got back there. Today, people are baptized wherever they can find enough water. They've seen them online and being baptized in hospital shower rooms, or in pools, or in Africa where water's scarce, in trash cans, as long as there's just enough. But if there are any tonight that we can help you along your journey to salvation, whether it is in baptism or if you're in need of support and prayer, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.